Many people believe that bear spray is like having a magical force field of safety. It's a superhero sidekick that keeps you protected from potential wild animal encounters. With bear spray by their side, people venture fearlessly into the territory of predators. However, bear spray doesn't always work, and sometimes it only makes the animals more angry. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we take a look at 3 times bear spray didn't work and the terrifying attacks that happened next. Welcome to Final Affliction.
With the exception of his dog, Daniel worked alone. The rough, rugged terrain of the Alaskan mountains were his perfect office. He used his cabin in Turnagain as a base and set off on foot from it each day to work on the trail. The cabin was a couple of miles from a paved road that connected the community of Hope to the Seward Highway. The picturesque spot was about 25 miles southeast of Anchorage. On July 29, 2020, Daniel awoke early. He looked out through his cabin's window. He could see that he was blessed with clear blue skies for the day. He dressed in his gear, putting on his sturdy boots and clipping his bear spray canister onto his belt. It is believed he also placed his handgun in his backpack. During his construction work, he preferred to keep bear spray on him rather than a firearm. A shotgun or rifle weighed him down and got in the way. Daniel didn't plan on being out for long and decided he would return to the cabin for lunch later in the day. He picked up his water bottle and after a quick breakfast, he whistled to his dog and stepped outside. The two of them set off towards the path he was constructing. It was less than a mile from the cabin. Sawing down saplings and lopping off branches, Daniel gradually inched along the route he was carving through the great Alaskan wilderness. His dog carelessly sniffed around the surrounding trees and wandered through the clearing as Daniel worked. As midday loomed, the dense foliage sheltered Daniel from the growing heat of the rising sun. It was tiring work, and he paused for a breather, wiping the sweat from his brow and taking a sip from his water bottle, when suddenly, a brown bear came crashing through the undergrowth. Daniel barely had time to react. He fumbled for the bear spray, pointing it directly at the charging grizzly. He emptied the entire contents of the canister before the bear flattened him to the floor. Daniel struggled to breathe. The full force of the bear had knocked the wind from his lungs, and now it stood pushing down on him, its giant paws pressed firmly on his chest. Daniel kicked and thrashed about, trying desperately to hit the bear. He smacked the bear again and again on the snout, but this only enraged the bear more. It let out a deep, guttural growl and opened its jaws. Daniel could see saliva dripping from its jowls as it lowered its head menacingly. Ferociously, it bit into Daniel's face. He let out a yell as a tooth hit bone. Again, the bear bit down and scraped its claws over Daniel's chest. The attack that ensued was likely brutal and ferocious, but no one knows quite what happened to Daniel. His tragic death was both a shock to those who knew him and a mystery to others. His dog found its way home, and when Daniel's wife saw the dog arrive home without Daniel, she hurriedly called his friends. None of them had seen him. Working within such dense vegetation, it is likely that Daniel didn't see the bear until it was right upon him. If he did have his handgun in his backpack like his friend said he did, then there definitely wouldn't have been enough time to use it. Maybe it was his dog that alerted him to the bear, maybe Daniel had time to retreat a little, maybe the dog provoked the attack, no one quite knows. After Daniel's wife called his friends, raising the alarm, they went to check on him. They assumed that he may have fallen and sprained an ankle or broken a leg. Walking past his cabin, they followed the path that Daniel had carved through the undergrowth. Little more than a mile along the path, his friends stopped in their tracks. They had found Daniel's body on the ground, bloodied and lifeless. His injuries were consistent with a brown bear attack. In those desperately sad and heart-stopping moments, they called the local police department to report the terrible news. Daniel's wife and friends were in utter disbelief that he was gone. He was such an experienced outdoorsman. They knew his knowledge and hunting expertise had served him well throughout the years, but now their worlds came crashing down. State wildlife biologists arrived on the scene. The stench of pepper spray was still in the air. The empty canister was found about 15 feet from Daniel's body. A thorough scout of the area found nothing that would have attracted a bear, such as a moose carcass or other food sources. Daniel had been working relatively close to 6 Mile Creek, a salmon spawning stream, but officials didn't consider it close enough to the attack site for Daniel to be considered prey. The puzzling evidence found by field experts was that both black bear and brown bear DNA were found on Daniel's body. It is usual for these bears to tolerate each other, and often black bears give the larger grizzlies a wide berth. However, with evidence of both bears present at the attack site, some locals considered them to have attacked Daniel together, a form of teamwork amongst bears. This, however, is highly unlikely. Bears are largely solitary animals. They do not hunt in pairs or groups, and subspecies never socially mix with one another. In fact, brown bears have been known to kill black bears. So what exactly did happen to Daniel? The most likely explanation is that he unknowingly disturbed a large female brown bear, which attacked him. She wasn't necessarily preying on him, but had been startled and had felt threatened. She was eliminating this threat from her territory by attacking the intruder. Uninterested in eating him, she left the kill site. If bears cannot eat their prey then and there, they often cover it up, hiding it from other predators and scavengers in order to return to it later. There was no evidence of Daniel's body being partially buried or hidden with dirt or foliage. Bear spray may sting the eyes and nose when in direct contact, but it can also attract bears. In this case, a black bear was probably attracted either by the smell of the spray or by the fresh kill and made its way to Daniel's body. This would explain the presence of both bear subspecies at the site. But why was the bear spray ineffective during the initial attack? The regional wildlife supervisor for the Alaskan Department of Fish and Game, who was tasked with investigating Daniel's death, suspected the bear spray was faulty. The spray is sold by Costco stores in Anchorage and is manufactured by a company called UDAP. There had been concerns that some cans manufactured between March and August of that year could have been defective. There is also strong criticism over the effectiveness of bear spray, particularly regarding wind direction, which could result in the spray being blown away from the target. A flyby of the area where Daniel had been killed the following day found 2 black bears and 1 brown bear within several miles of Daniel's location. It's probable that many other bears were also in close proximity, but these were not spotted by officials. The DNA evidence collected from swabs of Daniel's body and clothing pointed towards 2 female bears. A week after the attack, wildlife biologists shot and killed 3 female black bears and 1 female grizzly. DNA from one of the black bears matched that found at the kill site. DNA from that brown bear did not. Following a bear attack, there is always some debate about the use of pepper spray. Some swear by it, others say it is foolish to go into bear territory without a high-caliber firearm. Although rangers and wildlife experts always recommend the use of bear spray over a firearm, research has shown that bear spray can actually be an attractant for some bears. Scientists studying bears in Alaska's Katmai National Park in the 1990s found that the majority of the bears they observed actually rolled and wriggled around in spray the researchers had sprayed onto the ground. They were vigorously scent rubbing their entire bodies in the spray residue. Sprayed directly from a can, however, results in the stinging of the eyes and nose, and this is thought to deter an approaching bear. The cause of Daniel's attack remains a mystery. It is still not known whether the attack was defensive or predatory. What has been determined, however, is that he was killed by a female brown bear who are notorious for mauling anyone who stands between her and her cubs, often leading to the unfortunate victim's final affliction. Researcher Stephen Riley had been deployed in the Arctic Circle to investigate the melting ice caps and the impact of global warming on the wild and marine life in the frozen vast expanse. Stephen had always wanted to witness the northern lights in the night sky, so he was glad that he got the chance to be there at just the time when Aurora Borealis is most clearly visible. It was a serene, heavenly place away from the distractions of life. He and his team had been staying at a caravan trailer parked a few miles from where they needed the samples. For the week that they stayed at the site, the night sky would sometimes be a clear, star-studded window into outer space, and other times a spectacular display of colors in the sky from the Aurora Borealis. But inhabiting this beautiful place were beasts that had seldom encountered humans. The most ferocious of these is the polar bear. At over 2 meters in height and weighing more than 1,000 pounds, these mammals were comfortable at the top of the Arctic food chain, feeding on everything from seals, walruses, and even beluga whales. However, global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps had been depleting the natural marine life of the area, and polar bears were starting to go long stretches of time hungry and without hunting. Stephen Riley finally got a chance to witness the northern lights about a week into their research trip, and he took several photographs of the beautiful display before returning to his caravan. In contact with his supervisor over the phone, Stephen was instructed to collect more samples of the thinning ice a few miles from their caravan. He was frustrated with his supervisor and tried to explain that the lack of marine life in this frozen wasteland was enough evidence that the ice was thinning due to global warming. The supervisor on the phone refused to budge and ordered him to collect and bring back more samples for research. Stephen angrily hung up the phone and decided to get it over with by going out into the freezing cold and getting the ice samples himself. He chose a site about a few kilometers from their caravan for the ice samples, but the foot-deep snow and blazing cold winds made it extremely difficult and time-consuming to walk there. He had no choice but to bring back the samples, which he thought would prove to his supervisors that he was right all along. Global warming had caused ice sheets on the water to melt and crack, leaving floating islands of ice separated by several feet of freezing water. Stephen had to hop from one sheet to the next and slowly make his way to the chosen site. He finally identified an appropriate spot to chisel off a piece of ice on the edge of the floating sheet. He crouched down and took out his tools for the job. Hunched over right on the cusp of the ice-cold water, he heard light splashes followed by a grunt. He couldn't get a good view of what it was and dismissed the sound for a whale or seal beneath the water. He heard the grunt again, and this time it sounded louder and closer. He realized it was not coming from beneath the water, but from behind him. He turned back and spotted a massive body of white fur over 7 feet tall right as it jumped at him. Frightened out of his senses, he instinctively ducked and felt the sharp claws of the animal scratch his shoulder as it plunged into the water on the other side. Stephen quickly realized the vulnerability of his circumstance. He had no transportation, no weapon, and no communication to contact his colleagues at the camp. He was alone in the vast frozen wasteland several miles away from safety, and all he had was a small can of bear spray in his backpack. He had only a few seconds to frantically search for it with his freezing and jittery cold hands before the polar bear clambered out of the water and ran after him once again. From the weight of the massive bear jumping at Stephen, the floating ice sheet wobbled and tilted, further throwing him off. He spotted the head of the beast coming out of the water as he unzipped his bag and rummaged through it trying to find the spray can. He finally found it and immediately turned around to spray the bear that was now charging right toward him. The intense and pungent smell of the chemicals inside the bear spray threw it off momentarily as it turned around and jumped back into the water. Stephen realized he had just bought himself a few more seconds to escape. He dropped his bag where it was and made a run for the caravan as fast as he could. The adrenaline was pumping, his heart was beating fast as he jumped from one ice sheet to the next, spraying the can behind him as he went. In desperation and the pain from his wound, he slipped on the sheet of ice and dropped the bear spray, which landed right in the water. He didn't have the time to recover it or the heart to look back, so he continued running as fast as possible in the direction of his caravan. As he ran, he tripped again on the edge of an ice sheet while trying to jump from one to the next. This time, he plunged into the water. The icy cold water drained him of any heat or energy that Stephen's body had retained by this point as he splashed around trying to get back up on his feet. However, before he could even get out of the water, he noticed the loud growls of the bear swimming behind him. His hands and legs numb from the freezing water made it much harder for him to get up and run. He let out a scream in terror. The bear got out of the water behind him and charged at Stephen, a terrifying, huge mass of fur. The sight of the predator running towards him with vicious intent numbed his senses. He was barely able to crawl now. With the caravan only a half a kilometer away, he tried desperately to scream to his colleagues at the campsite, but to no avail. The bear finally caught up to him, and by this time, the bear spray had been washed off its nose from swimming in the water. Now, there was nothing that could stop Stephen from being eaten alive by the hungry polar bear. He was left defenseless, numb, and terrified out of his senses. The bear stood up on its 2 hind feet and then slammed its 2 front feet straight onto Stephen's neck, snapping it in half. Stephen's fate was now sealed. The bear ripped its claws into his torso and neck, and he could only let out a slight squeal in his final moments before being devoured by the bear piece by piece. All that was later found by his colleagues at the spot was a few torn clothes, some bones and flesh, and a reddened spot in the white snow that told the tale of Stephen's final affliction.
Yellowstone National Park is an American national park located in the western United States, largely in the northwest corner of Wyoming and extending into Montana and Idaho. Yellowstone was the first national park in the U.S. and is also widely held to be the first national park in the world. The park is known for its many geothermal features, especially the Old Faithful geyser, one of its most popular. While it represents many types of biomes, the subalpine forest is the most abundant. It's part of the South Central Rockies forest ecoregion, which spans an area of 3,468 square miles. It comprises of lakes, canyons, rivers, and beautiful mountain ranges. Yellowstone Lake is one of the largest high-elevation lakes in North America and is centered over the Yellowstone caldera, the largest supervolcano on the continent. It has erupted with tremendous force several times in the last 2 million years and is overdue to explode again soon. Grizzly bears, wolves, and free-ranging herds of bison and elk live in this park. It's safe to say Yellowstone National Park is a dangerous place to be, and with numerous recreational opportunities, including hiking, camping, boating, fishing, and sightseeing attracting nearly 5 million visitors each year, it's no surprise that it's seen its fair share of tragic deaths. On April 15, 2021, Charles Mock, who was 40 years old at the time, set out into the park to do some fishing in the place he loved most, Yellowstone National Park. Charles was always an avid lover of the outdoors, ever since early childhood. But out of all places in the world he fell in love with, Yellowstone. When he turned 30, he moved there permanently, just so he could spend every bit of spare time he had in the park. The overwhelming sense of peace and happiness he experienced in the rugged remoteness of the park was so much that he soon sought out work inside the park. Charles wanted to spend every waking second of the day in Yellowstone, and finally got his wish when he landed a job as a tour guide for backcountry adventure. Charles wanted to catch some trout at his favorite fishing spot on the Madison River, deep in the wilderness of Yellowstone. He was aware of the risks and dangers that come with venturing this far into the wild, but had been fishing all week without any problems. It's well known that the presence of grizzly bears is an everlasting threat to the lives of all fishermen, hunters, hikers, campers. Anyone venturing into the wilderness here is advised to carry some form of self-protection, and Charles knew this. He always made sure to keep his pistol and bear spray with him, just in case he ever had to use it. But after a week of fishing, he felt safe enough to leave his pistol at home and only bring with him his bear spray. Charles arrived at the river and began unpacking his equipment from his truck. He gathered his fishing pole, camera, and supplies, and began soaking in the peace that he always felt here. He also brought along his tackle box full of other important items and began his half-a-mile hike down the trail towards the water. As always, he kept a wary eye out during the walk for the variety of dangerous animals in the area. Bison, grizzly bears, and even moose have been involved in attacks on humans in prior years, and that was the last thing Charles wanted to come across alone in the wilderness. He'd had his fair share of bears encounters throughout the years. Charles and his friend Riley had numerous run-ins with grizzlies who had even bluff-charged them several times to intimidate them. Luckily, they were always just warnings to scare off the men who, thankfully, were never actually attacked, but a terrifying experience nonetheless. As Charles walked along the riverbank, looking for a good spot to dip his line and snap photos of the beautiful scenery, he unknowingly walked into one of the most dangerous situations he could have found. It was a large moose carcass that looked to be half-eaten by a grizzly bear. What Charles failed to realize was that the bear who claimed this food source had already been fighting to defend its food to the point of killing and partially eating another grizzly. It was still enraged and irritated from the fight and watching in the distance. Charles froze as soon as he realized what he was walking towards and quietly scanned the tree line while listening carefully for any signs of the bear. He slowly began backing up the way he came, being careful not to turn his back to the carcass. He knew that if the grizzly was watching, it would be more likely to attack him while his back was turned. All of a sudden, Charles heard a loud woof sound that he recognized as a bear, which sent shivers down his spine. He immediately stopped in his tracks and surveyed the area around him for the upset bear. while simultaneously pulling out his bear spray as a precaution, as he prepared himself mentally for what is typically a very tense standoff. As he searched the brush for the bear, the forest turned eerily silent for a few seconds. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the bear charging toward him. Carl prayed that it was just another bluff charge. Time stood still for Charles as he watched the bear's eyes focusing solely on him as it came rocketing in his direction. The bear closed the last 100 feet of distance with blinding speed as Charles unloaded his bear spray at the grizzly. The orange cloud of bear spray engulfed the bear, but it seemed to have done nothing but make the bear more angry as it quickly tackled and knocked Charles to the ground. The 700-pound bear pinned Charles to the ground and focused its attack on Charles' head and neck. It swiped its massive claws through Charles' flesh, while its powerful jaws carved grooves into his skull. The bear seemed to be targeting its attack on Charles' head, continuously biting and swiping at his scalp, removing significant portions of flesh in the process. It then bit into his neck, tearing flesh and crucial arteries from his body. Blood started to spray onto the bear and forest around him. Charles desperately raised his hands over his head and neck as a shield, but the bear clamped down on them and crushed them into useless lumps of bleeding flesh. Then the bear went in for the kill. It gripped Charles' head in its mouth and squeezed down in an attempt to crush his skull, but only managed to penetrate one of its canine teeth fully through his skull. Now, with a 2-inch hole through Charles' skull, his hands mangled and his scalp torn to shreds, the bear stopped the attack and went back to the moose carcass just a few hundred feet away. Charles was now laying unconscious in a pool of his own blood, barely hanging onto life. He gained consciousness about 10 minutes later, and despite his condition, he was determined to get to an area to reach out for help. He tried crawling, but the pain was so overwhelming he was unable to move. Charles managed to prop himself in an upright position against a tree stump where he slowly searched his supplies with his only useful hand to find his cell phone to call for help. He dialed 911, and emergency responders were immediately dispatched. Charles remained on the phone with 911 for nearly an hour while he waited. He had to direct the officers to his location, somewhere deep in Yellowstone National Park. When they found him, he was still clutching his bear spray can in his functioning hand, despite it being completely emptied on the bear previously. He was stabilized to the best of their abilities at the scene and immediately transported to the Eastern Idaho Emergency Medical Center in Idaho Falls for life-saving emergency medical support. The next day, as Charles and the medical team fought for his life, Montana game wardens approached the area. They made a lot of noise and were very clear in their efforts to run the bear off so they could complete their investigation into the attack. However, the bear had other plans. As they approached the attack scene, it emerged from cover in the same threatening manner as it addressed Charles. The bear's head was low with its ears pinned back in a clear sign of aggression. The wardens fired off special rounds that crackle and pop in an attempt to persuade the bear to back off, but it failed. As the bear powered toward the 7 volunteers and their dog, it got bogged down in some thick brush, temporarily slowing its attack. The bear quickly regained its traction and continued its advance toward the group. The bear reached within 40 feet of the men before they discharged lethal rounds and dropped the bear. As its blood seeped into the soil, its rage and aggression dissipated as it stopped all movement. The wardens performed a necropsy on the bear's carcass and investigated the attack scene. On Charles' clothes, they had noted the contents of his bear spray can. As they examined the bear, the same was found on its fur, meaning that Charles had in fact discharged his bear spray successfully. Once the bear had been cut open and the contents of its guts analyzed, the wardens determined that the bear had been feeding on the moose it was defending. They also found tissue from at least one other grizzly bear, confirming that the grizzly bear was previously fighting off other bears in defense of its meal. This is the most likely reason the bear was so aggressive towards Charles and the wardens. Back at the medical center, Charles had 2 surgical procedures in an attempt to save him. According to doctors, the surgeries went well, but sadly, within a few days, Charles suffered a severe stroke and died from the trauma inflicted during the bear attack. West Yellowstone organized a memorial service at the Union Pacific Dining Lodge in town, and his family held their own private ceremony in commemoration of Charles. 2 nights after Charles was mauled, the town of West Yellowstone had another bear visit them. The locals point out that the bears are so numerous that they can hardly avoid run-ins with them. The greater Yellowstone area, which spans portions of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, is reported to have more than 700 grizzly bears. Fatal attacks have increased in recent decades as the bears recover from their threatened status. Humans have also begun moving into rural areas more than ever before. Since 2010, grizzlies have killed 8 people. They are still under federal protection in areas outside of Alaska, although recent discussions have begged review of that status. More and more people fear that as long as the grizzlies remain protected, their numbers will continue to rise, increasing the chances of more innocent people meeting their unfortunate final affliction.